Back in 1998, Nintendo revolutionized the mobile gaming scene with the release of the original Game Boy. By this point, Nintendo was hot off the success of the original NES, and they were ready to try producing another handheld console like they did in the past with the Game & Watch. The original Game Boy exploded in popularity, selling over 118 million units, which makes it the third most sold video game console of all time. The only two consoles being it are the PS2 in the number 1 spot, and the original DS, which was an eventual successor of the Game Boy, in the number 2 slot. Nintendo struck gold with handheld gaming in the 1990s, and it only grew from there. Many competitors tried to beat out Nintendo, and a lot of these competitors released mobile consoles that were more advanced, more powerful, and just superior to the Game Boy from a technical standpoint, but none of them prevailed past the success of the Game Boy. Sony is the company that is most known for being a rival to Nintendo when it comes to the handheld gaming market, as they pretty much released the most successful handheld console that was not produced by Nintendo. They released the PSP, or the PlayStation Portable, back in the early 2000s, which was actually a very successful console. Nowhere near to the excess of the DS, but it was good enough to warrant a successor, which released in 2012, known as the PlayStation Vita. The PlayStation Vita, in my opinion, is a fantastic console that is a lot of fun, but unfortunately the console did not do well. On paper, the PS Vita is stronger, more powerful, and in a way better, quote unquote, than the 3DS. However, it struggled in comparison to the 3DS, selling significantly less units and essentially being abandoned by Sony less than 2 years after the release. This just shows you how much of a juggernaut Nintendo is in the handheld gaming console market, and how no other company, even a giant company like Sony, can't even come close. Despite being the only other mobile gaming console on the market, the funny thing is, it wasn't even as close to being a competitor to Nintendo in the mobile gaming scene compared to smartphones. Even though smartphone manufacturers aren't exactly game companies producing game consoles, the ease of access when it comes to playing games on phone were the biggest hindrance to the 3DS's success. It seems like the Game Boy only increased in popularity as the years went on as well, as many of the top-selling games for the console were released many years after the release of the original Game Boy, with the original Pokemon games being the second best-selling games on the console despite releasing 7 years after the console's initial launch. It's only natural that Nintendo continued their handheld success, releasing more handheld consoles in the future after the Game Boy. The Game Boy eventually turned into the Nintendo DS, and the most recent pure handheld console we have from Nintendo is the 3DS, which initially released in 2010 in Japan, but has had quite a few hardware revisions, with the most recent of which releasing in 2017. I already have a video talking more about the 3DS and how it's on its last legs in terms of getting support from Nintendo for multiple releases, but despite this, we don't really have any information on a new, purely handheld console from Nintendo. The 3DS has been out for over 9 years at this point, and seeing Nintendo's track record with handheld consoles, you would think that we are due for a new one. The 3DS is old, it's not getting many games anymore, and I feel like Nintendo is supporting it a lot less than it has in the past, which again is only natural for an aging console. The most recent console release for Nintendo was the Nintendo Switch in 2017, almost exactly 2 years ago the release of this video, which is a great console that has been doing very well for Nintendo. This is amazing for Nintendo, especially after the failure of the Wii U, which I also plan on making another video on, by the way. But what does the Switch mean for Nintendo's next mobile console line? The unique thing about Nintendo Switch is, yes, it is primarily a home console, and Nintendo did state that the Switch is not supposed to be a successor to the 3DS, but unlike the Nintendo Switch's home console competitors like the PS4 or Xbox One, the Switch can also be played in a handheld mode, similar to other handheld consoles in the past. This is amazing, and I think this is a big part as to why the Switch is so loved by fans today. You can play something like Smash Ultimate at home on your TV, then if you go on a long train ride or something, you can take your Switch with you and play it on the go. The Switch really bridged the gap between mobile console and home console, but what does this mean for Nintendo's pure mobile or handheld console line? Handheld consoles have been a staple in Nintendo's history since the original release of the Game Boy, with Nintendo's mobile console typically outselling the home console counterpart of that generation. The Game Boy Advance sold more units than the GameCube, the DS sold more units than the Wii, and not too surprisingly, the 3DS sold more units than the Wii U. Nintendo has even stated the Switch is not intended to replace the 3DS, which I want to reiterate again because I'm sure somebody's going to comment about this anyway. but it still raises the question as to what is next for Nintendo's mobile consoles, and if they weren't exactly telling the truth with that, and if the Switch is actually going to be the next successor to the 3DS in a way. Rumors have been floating around all over the place for a while now about some sort of Nintendo Switch Mini, which essentially would be a smaller, more affordable version of the Switch, focused mostly on handheld gaming. I personally think this would be a fantastic idea by Nintendo, and even though I have the original Switch, it would still be something that I would consider getting. It's pretty much inevitable that the Switch will get some form of hardware revision in the future, as pretty much every single console gets some sort of revision, and the Switch has been out for over 2 years now, and Nintendo is no stranger to releasing hardware revisions as we've seen with the 3DS. This cheaper Switch would be great for people who can't afford a regular Switch right now, and for people who don't really care about playing their Switch on TV at home, and would much rather have a handheld console they can fit on their pocket, as the regular Switch is a little bit too big to just be shoved into your pocket. Nintendo did something similar to this with the 3DS line, releasing the 2DS about 2.5 years into the original 3DS's lifecycle. The whole premise of this was that it is a cheaper alternative to the 3DS, with a few sacrifices like not having a 3D slider and not having a clamshell design. They also released the same day as Pokemon X and Y in 2013, and seeing how main series Pokemon games have been Nintendo's best-selling mobile franchise since they came out, it isn't too unlikely to think that we will see a Switch Mini release this holiday season to help people play Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield on the go, which are the first new generation Pokemon games on a new console, just like X and Y was for the 3DS back in the day. Now, Nintendo mentioned a long time ago that Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon would be the last main series Pokemon games on the 3DS, and Pokemon Sword and Shield being on the Switch raises another question, as Pokemon has always been on a purely handheld console. This supports the idea that the Switch is actually the next mobile console from Nintendo, despite what they may have said in the past. In my opinion, when you think about it, it would have been really dumb for Nintendo to outright say that the Switch is not only their next home console, but also their next handheld console as well, since that would have effectively killed the 3DS back in 2017, which is a little bit earlier than they wanted to. Nintendo is going to ride the 3DS as long as they possibly can, and although the console is aging and is very close to the end of its life cycle, they might as well squeeze out as much as they can from hardware and software for the 3DS, since if they straight up said the 3DS was dead and that the Switch was the successor, a lot less people would buy consoles and a lot less people would buy 3DS games. Personally, I would still love to see another purely handheld focused console from Nintendo. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities in the slightest to expect one for the next few years or so, but at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if 2019 is the last year for the 3DS before it officially dies in 2020, and Nintendo focuses 100% of their efforts on the Switch. Mobile gaming in general has changed drastically since the release of the original Game Boy in 1989, and it's even changed a lot since the 3DS's initial release in 2010, thanks to the rise of smartphones. There's thousands of games you can play on a smartphone, and some smartphone games even have console ports on them, which is kind of crazy to think about it since they're actually pretty faithful to the original. Pretty much everybody nowadays has some sort of mobile device, whether it's a cell phone or a tablet, and I'd be willing to bet that the majority of people watching this video are watching on a smartphone or tablet. Nintendo has started to get into this handheld mobile smartphone market as well, with games like Animal Crossing Pocket Camp, Super Mario Run, Fire Emblem Heroes, and Mario Kart Tour, which should be releasing sometime this year in 2019. This could realistically be the future for Nintendo's mobile-only games, while the Switch remains this half-home, half-mobile console hybrid, with more of a focus of being a home console. I know it's super early to speculate on this, but a time will come where the Switch dies and we will see a brand new home console from Nintendo, and I wonder if it'll be like the Switch where it's a hybrid, or more of a traditional home console like the PlayStation 4 or any other previous Nintendo home console. Either way, this is a very interesting and very exciting time to be a Nintendo fan, as we have a lot to look forward to. I still remember the day that my dad came home and got me an original Game Boy Color with a copy of Pokemon Red, and it's memories like that that really make me love Nintendo, especially their handheld consoles. Their handheld consoles are something I've adored for pretty much my whole life, and they're probably some of my most played consoles in existence. Maybe we'll see something like the Game Boy Mini to sort of fill that gap a little bit, kind of like what we saw with the NES Mini and the SNES Mini, or maybe come E3 2019, Nintendo will come completely out of nowhere and reveal a new handheld console. Nobody knows for sure what is next, and anything is possible. The Switch and the rise of smartphones could possibly mark the end of Nintendo's handheld-only consoles, but that will never take away from the legacy Nintendo has created with consoles like the original Game Boy or the 3DS, and how much joy they brought to each and every one of us Nintendo fans.